Hello, this is Chapter 9, and in Chapter 9 we're going to be talking about economic fluctuations. Particularly we'll talk about the business cycles. So in previous chapters we've talked about how the economy works in the long run. So we've talked about long run growth and determinants of growth, but now we're going to look and focus on short run fluctuations. So movements around that long run growth trend that we discussed in chapters 7 and 8. So do a brief overview and a brief introduction to business cycles. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to overview the chapter. We're going to look at aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and then take a look at stabilization policy. Now in Lecture 2 we're going to develop a fairly naive or very simple model of aggregate demand, and then in Chapter 10 we'll come back and develop a little bit stronger model of aggregate demand. So, some simple facts about business cycles. 1. GDP growth averages somewhere between 3 and 3.5% per year in the long run in the U.S. U.S. data, we have right around 3% per year growth over the long run average. However, business cycles fluctuate around that. As you notice, say for the last 5 years or so, we've been a little bit below that 3% level. Consumption investment fluctuate with GDP. All right, consumption, they move in the same directions. They tend to be positively correlated, but consumption's much less volatile than investment. So one of the empirical puzzles or empirical regularities that we'll want to look at and understand is, so why is investment more volatile than consumption? Next, unemployment rises during recessions, falls during expansions. That's fairly self-explanatory. So this is another reason why we might want to dampen business cycles, because unemployment can be very disruptive. Then finally, in this particular lesson, we're going to talk about something called Okun's law. Okun's law is actually it's an empirical regularity. It's something we tend to see, and there's a negative relationship between GDP and unemployment, and it's actually a little more complicated than that, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in just a few seconds. So taking a look, just let's play around and look with some data. We say here is real GDP growth rate written in blue, and then the consumption growth is in red. And you can see that, well, consumption moves very closely with real GDP. Now there's one explanation for that. Is simple. Consumption makes up about 70% of real GDP. So the biggest portion of GDP is consumption, so they should move together. You can see, though, that real GDP growth might be just a titch more volatile than is consumption growth. And now we kind of see why. Investment makes up another big part of GDP. And you can see that the growth rate investment is much more volatile, much more sensitive to the boom and bust cycle or recessions and expansions. And we tend to see significant decreases in investment during recessions, and then equally significant increases in investment during expansionary periods. Unemployment, again, if you look at those pink bars that are on the graph, those are the NBER, that's the National Bureau of Economic Research, recession dates. So the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, has what's called a business cycle dating committee, who comes in and looks at the data and decides when do the recessions start and when do they stop. And there's a few things you'll notice about this graph. One, you'll notice that unemployment almost always increases during a recession and decreases during expansionary periods. But you'll also see that in several of these, so we have here, here, and here, in these recessions, and which is actually quite typical, you'll see unemployment peak after the recession. Well, the employment cycle tends to lag the business cycle. So actual response in laying people off or hiring people tends to lag behind the actual business cycle a little bit, and that makes sense. If we have an expansion, Well, it takes a little bit of time for businesses to recognize that, for that to see that in their bottom line, so to speak, and takes them a little while to start hiring more people after recession. And likewise, it sometimes takes a little while to realize the recession's coming on. Which leads us to this idea of Okun's law, or Okun's empirical regularity. So what we have here is plotted as changes in real GDP and changes in the unemployment rate. And you'll see they are quite strongly negatively related. And usually what we think of, though, with Okun's law is in terms of gaps. So how much more unemployment do we have than the natural rate of unemployment versus how much less GDP growth we have than the kind of potential level or long-run level of GDP growth. And those two gaps tend to be negatively related. This is a very simple way of looking at Okun's law, but as you can see, there is a fairly strong negative relationship. And it does kind of tend to make sense if we think about it.